Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm really glad you're here tonight. I know how rare it is to actually find a quiet moment in the middle of everything. So, tonight's story is designed to be a bit of an anchor for you. It's a chance to just slow down and listen. If you find yourself coming back to these videos, please do consider subscribing. It really helps a small channel like this grow. But for now, don't worry about any of that. Just settle in. He did not set out for a thrill. He walked because his brother had been dying. For weeks, that small bedroom had been thick with the smell of boiled sage and damp wool. The shutters stayed latched to keep out the night air, making the room feel like it was under a spell of cold. Every night, he sat in a low chair by the bed and listened. He listened to the whistle of a breath that sounded far too thin. He stayed there until his knees felt like stone against the floorboards. When the last candle finally sputtered out into a bead of blue light, he made a pact with the quiet. If his brother pulled through, he would walk. Not a few miles, but hundreds. He would go north, on foot, all the way to Santiago de Compostela. He wouldn't complain about the rain or the blisters. He would just carry the silence of the road. His brother got better, slowly. It wasn't a sudden flash of health. It was a slow crawl back. A deeper breath on Monday. A bit of soup on Wednesday. By the time his brother could sit up, the man knew it was time to go. He found a heavy cloak that smelled of old sheep and laced up boots with heels already worn down. He took a loaf of bread, some salted meat, and a staff made of ash wood. Then he closed his door and started toward the hills. The first week was a lesson in the earth. He learned the exact weight of a wool cloak when it gets soaked with morning mist. He learned how gravel sounds when you've stepped on it 10,000 times. He walked through the deep woods where the oaks were so old they seemed to be leaning on each other for support. The ground was soft, centuries of moss and needles that dampened every step. He stopped counting the miles and started counting his breaths. 4 steps in, 4 steps out. On the 10th day, he entered a forest of silver birch. The trees were thin and white, standing like ghosts in the early morning light. A low mist clung to the ground, swirling around his ankles as he walked. The world here was drained of colour. Everything was a shade of grey or pearl. He found himself walking slower, matching his pace to the stillness of the trees. He watched the way the bark of the birch trees peeled in thin, paper-like strips. He touched one, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath. There were no birds singing here. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from a leaf hitting the ferns below. Tap, tap. It was a rhythmic, peaceful sound. He felt as though the forest was breathing with him. He sat down on a fallen log and watched the mist move through the branches, shifting and changing shape. He stayed there for a long time, not thinking about the miles ahead or the miles behind. He just existed in the grey light, feeling the damp air on his skin and the steady beat of his heart. 3 days later, he came to an ancient stone bridge that spanned a deep, narrow gorge. The water below was a dark, churning green, but up on the bridge the air was perfectly still. The stones were massive and cold. He could see the marks of the chisels left by the men who had built it centuries ago. He walked to the middle of the span and leaned over the low wall. He watched the water move, spinning in slow eddies around the base of the piers. He thought about the concept of a bridge, a way to get from one side to the other. He felt like he was on a bridge himself, moving between his old life and whatever came next. He dropped a small pebble into the water and waited. It seemed to take forever to hit the surface. When it did, the sound was swallowed up by the roar of the river. He stayed on that bridge until the sun began to set, watching the shadows of the arches stretch across the water. By the end of the second week, the land began to rise sharply. He found himself on the edge of the high peaks, where the air turned thin and smelled of wet granite. A heavy fog rolled in, thick as wool, hiding the path ahead. He didn't rush. He slowed his pace, placing each foot carefully on the slick stones. The world had shrunk to a circle of 10 feet around him. Inside that circle, everything was sharp. The orange lichen on the rocks, the tiny droplets of water hanging from the gorse bushes, the dark soil between the roots. He found a rhythm in the mist. He stopped looking for the horizon and started looking at the ground. He watched the way the mist moved, swirling in slow, ghostly patterns around his staff. He felt like he was walking through a dream. The dampness settled into his cloak, making it heavy and cold, but his skin stayed warm from the effort of the climb. He wasn't afraid of being lost. He realized that as long as he kept moving forward, he was exactly where he needed to be. On the 18th day, he found himself walking on stones that had been laid 2,000 years ago. The old Roman road cut a straight line through the valley, a grey ribbon of history under his feet. The stones were massive, worn smooth and round by centuries of wagons and feet. He thought about the thousands of people who had walked this same path before him. Soldiers, merchants, families and other pilgrims. He felt like he was part of a long, slow chain of human movement. He liked the sound of his staff hitting the stone, a sharp, rhythmic clack that echoed off the hills. He spent the entire day on that road, watching the sunlight shift from one side of the valley to the other. The air smelled of dry dust and wild thyme. He passed a ruined milestone, its carvings worn away by the rain, and felt a strange sense of companionship with the ghosts of the past. When he reached the lowlands of Minho, the sky turned the color of lead. A soft, steady rain began to fall. It wasn't the kind of rain that hits hard. It was the kind that just waits until it finds a way under your collar. He didn't look for a roof. He just kept his head down. He watched the way the dust turned into dark, rich clay. He smelled the ozone and the wet stone. The valley looked like it was being painted in real time. The ferns turning a deep, wet green, the hills disappearing into the fog. His boots were twice as heavy with the mud, but he liked the work of it. The rain washed the road grime off his face. It made him feel like he was part of the dirt and the water. He wasn't just a man passing through. He was a piece of the landscape. By the time he saw the walls of Barcelos, he was walking on instinct. His legs felt like lead, but they kept moving. The land was beautiful. Long rows of vineyards that looked like a green sea under the plum-colored sky. He walked over the bridge as the sun was setting. The river was muttering to itself, moving over smooth stones without any hurry. Lanterns were starting to glow in the windows of the white houses. He wasn't looking for a miracle then. He just wanted a chair and a dry floor. The inn was full of the sound of people and the heat of a big hearth. He could smell wood smoke, garlic, and bay leaves. On a spit near the fire, a rooster was turning slowly. Its skin was crisp and golden, dripping juices onto the coals with a sharp hiss. He sat in a corner and felt the blood return to his feet. It was a stinging, warm relief. He watched the shadows of the fire jump across the ceiling and thought about how close he was to finishing his vow. Then the guards came in. There had been a theft, some silver gone from a rich man's house. He was the only one in the room with mud on his cloak and no friends to vouch for him. In a town full of neighbors, the man from the road is always the thief. The magistrate didn't want to hear about vows or sick brothers. He was eating dinner with his friends. On the table in front of him sat that same roasted rooster from the fire, sitting in a pool of its own gravy on a silver platter. The pilgrim stood there, shaking with exhaustion, but keeping his voice steady. He told the truth, but the judge just wanted the case closed. "Execution at dawn," the judge said, reaching for his wine. The pilgrim didn't beg. He just looked at the rooster on the table. It was cooked through, its legs tied, its head long gone. "I am as innocent," the man said, "as it is certain that this rooster will crow when they put the rope around my neck." The men at the table laughed into their cups. The judge didn't even look up. He just waved his hand, and the guards dragged the man to a cold cell. Dawn was a thin, cold line on the horizon. The grass in the square was soaked with dew, and the air was so still you could hear a bird's wings a mile away. The rope was rough and smelled like old rain. It felt like a dry itch against the man's throat. He closed his eyes. He wasn't trying to be brave. He was just very tired. The beam creaked, the rope went tight, and then, from the judge's house across the square, a crow. It was loud. It was sharp. It sounded like a bell in the morning quiet. The guards looked at each other. They didn't move. Then came another crow, even louder. Inside the dining hall, the roasted rooster had stood up on the silver platter. Its wings lifted. It crowed right at the judge, who was still wearing his fine robes from the night before. The judge's chair hit the floor as he scrambled up. He ran out the door and across the cobblestones, yelling for them to stop. They looked at the knot. It hadn't caught. It was tied loose, slipping just enough to let the man breathe. The judge cut it himself with a shaking hand. The pilgrim's boots hit the wet grass. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just sat there and took a long, deep breath of the cold morning air. The sky was turning from ash to silver. "Go," the judge whispered. "Just go." The innkeeper met him at the bridge. She didn't ask questions. She just handed him a loaf of bread and a flask of water. She looked at his neck, where the rope had left a red mark, but she didn't say a word. He walked out of the town as the sun came fully over the hills. The river was still muttering. The town was waking up. Shutters opening. The smell of baking bread. The sound of cows in the distance. He kept walking north. He finished the trip. Today, you see that rooster everywhere in Portugal. It's on the shelves and in the windows, painted in bright reds and yellows. People think of it as a lucky charm, but for the man on the road, it was something else. It was the sound of the truth breaking through the noise. But on that morning, as he walked away from the town, it was just three things. A man who was tired, a knot that didn't hold, and a rooster that found its voice. He took another breath, felt the air fill his lungs, and kept on walking.